Hello there, I'm Geraldine Doogue. Welcome to a special season's gift, a friendly guide to synodality. Now, you may or may not have heard much about the latest development in our church's moves to being more synodal or synodal, however you care to use the word. How do we walk together better as Catholics in the world, I think, is one way of putting it. Well, a big explanation emerged from the Vatican a couple of months ago called the final document, with an accompanying pathways for implementation. It is big. It has a lot to offer, drawing from the tradition, suggesting lots of ideas, but I wouldn't say it's poetic, if I can put it like that. It does take some reading. It's really worth it, but it does take some reading. Because of this, a group of us decided to tap the talents of some local Sydney Catholics to summarise and distill this document. Justice François Kunc, a Supreme Court judge who's known for his clear language, joined us, and Gail Gill as well. She's been involved in Catholic education and formation for a generation. We gathered in the crypt of the historic St Patrick's Church in the Rocks recently to have a general conversation about this, and we're going to bring you an edited version now. We began by hearing from Pope Leo himself, who addressed a special jubilee gathering of synodal teams in Rome recently, and it's really interesting hearing the way he thinks. Here he is now.
I think that what most of us experienced over the past number of years in preparation for the Synod and at the beginning of this new process of implementation is precisely that synodality, to use your words, is not a campaign. It is a way of being and a way of being church. It's a way of promoting an attitude which begins with learning to listen to one another. And the gift of listening is something which I think we all recognize, but which oftentimes has been lost in certain sectors of the church, and something which I think we need to continue to discover in terms of how valuable that is, beginning with listening to the Word of God, listening to one another, listening to the wisdom that we find in men and in women, in members of the church, and those who are searching that may not yet be or may never be members of the church, but are looking indeed for truth.
I think that sets us off, and this is the outline for tonight. Justice François Kunc will offer his distillation of the final document. He was appointed to the New South Wales Supreme Court in 2013. He's been deeply involved in church organisation, still is. He's a cantor too. You still are a cantor, aren't you? Retired. You've retired. Possessed as he is of an absolutely glorious tenor voice. So he'll speak for about 18 to 20 minutes. We'll have a short chat amongst ourselves. Then we'll return to hear a summary of this implementation document, which is a bit easier, to be candid, I think, but we'll see. That's Gail Gill's job. I'm delighted to say she's been involved in Catholic education in various roles for more than 30 years. She's from the Broken Bay Diocese, where she's fully absorbed in formation programs and social justice. And she'll take about the same time to chat. And then we'll open it up for general conversation, which I think will be very helpful, always looking at how we can be, specific and useful. And as I say, we'll finish definitely by 9 p.m. And now we have quite a few printouts of documents, which are going on those on the tables at the back, if you want to take them home, because all of this does take some absorbing. I'm well aware of it. And that's what tonight is, that we sort of felt that very few people were talking about synodality, and yet there was this crucial sort of time, I think, that we're living through, a new emphasis within our church that I think a lot of fellow parishioners haven't got the first clue about. So I do hope you'll be clearer when you leave. And I hand over to you now, François, to give us your summary.
Thank you, Geraldine, and good evening, everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you all. Can I begin by, in a sense, saying I'm going to start at the end, because Geraldine said to me, "You're really good at summarising documents, François. So can you summarise the final document and sort of tell us what it's all about?" And I have to confess it was probably one of the most challenging briefs I've had in a long time as a lawyer, to try and summarise the document. So you should all have this little piece of paper, a friendly guide to synodality, and I have tried very hard to really distill it to what it seems to me comes out of the document. But let me give a little bit of background first to the way I've approached it. I have read the final document, I hope without prejudice, preconception or anything else, because that's what I do in my day job. No prejudice, no preconception, just listen, read, think. On the assumption that it says what it means and it means what it says. Now, of course, we're working with an English translation. The official version is the Italian version, so I also had the Italian version with me, so that to the extent I thought there may have been something in the English translation that may not have been as clear as it could have been, I went back to check the Italian. I am more than happy to be corrected by anybody in this room. There are people in this room who are far more pastorally, theologically and otherwise literate than I am, so please feel free to tell me if you think I've got it wrong. But as an overall comment, my view is this, that the final document is at best unattractive and at worst impenetrable to an intelligent lay reader. And that is a problem, because it is unfortunate, and I don't mean any criticism of the people who put it together. It is, of course, the product of an incredibly hard-working group of people who lived an incredibly intense experience. And I have the greatest of respect for that. But when you are actually going out and really changing or adding to, developing the Church's doctrine in a fundamental way, really quite fundamental, then you would like to think that the way it's done is a clear communication. Because as I'm going to develop a bit, it makes it quite clear that synodality is constitutive of the Church. Now, the ecclesiologists among you can take me on, but I read that as essentially saying, if you are not doing synodality, whatever that may be, you are actually not doing something of the Church. It is a little bit like saying, I'm here to play soccer, but I've now decided that I'm going to pick up the ball and play by different rules. Now, it's fine to change the rules, or develop the rules, but you have to understand that you are doing something very important. Because as I'll say in a moment, in his covering note, the Pope says that this whole document is part of the ordinary magisterium of the Church. And I'll explain a little bit about that in a moment. But one of my concerns about the document is that the various reactions that it has received, which include fear, opposition, misunderstanding, indifference, are really in many respects probably partly or wholly caused by the difficulty in the expression of the document. Now, I was just having a great little discussion with Julie before. We said, oh, look, it's easier to understand than the Vatican II documents. I respectfully beg to differ. When they wrote the documents of Vatican II, which again were the product of a huge committee, they were intended to be, and always understood from the start, to be documents of the highest teaching authority of the Church. So they knew the genre of the document that they were writing, albeit, as we know, it was a new genre for conciliar documents because it departed from the traditional format of let him who says, because of course the language was always masculine, let him who says this be anathema. If you say this, anathema sit. You are wrong, it's not the teaching of the Church. So it was a discursive style. But at least they knew that they were writing something that was meant to be the product of the highest teaching authority of the Church. One of the issues I have with the document is that it's actually many things, or at least three. It is a beautiful and profound theological reflection, and by no means an easy one, of what synodality is. It's also a kind of report as to what we did and what happened. It's a bit like a report of a Royal Commission. We sat down, we listened, we talked, and then it's also some recommendations. And all of those are different genres, different styles, different means of communication, and which have different consequences. But if you then bundle them all up and say, well, the whole document is part of the ordinary magisterium, you are opening things up for potential confusion. Let me give you three little sources that I've also found quite helpful. Whether you agree with them or not is another question. There is a document of the International Theological Commission, which you can get online from the Vatican website, called Synodality in the Life of the Church. Now, yes, it's a theological read, but that's what it is. I mean, and you can read it fairly closely and easily because it's unashamedly theological, but it sets out in much more detail what the theological dimensions of synodality are. There is also, you can get online again, a very helpful little chat that Cardinal Fernandez, the prefect of the congregation or the dicastery for the faith, gave a few months ago to the baby bishops at Baby Bishop School. And he gave a speech where one of the useful things he did was the start was, here are 7 or 8 things that are not synodality. And that's always quite useful. If you want to know what something is, in a sort of old-fashioned Platonic way, you can also start by saying, well, this is what it is not. And then hopefully you'll get to a point where you understand what it's all about. And then there is also quite a useful article in the Australian Catholic Record from the July 2025 called A Synod on Synodality, a Tour of the Final Document by Archbishop Fisher. Now again, whatever you may agree or disagree with it, it's quite a useful document because he does go through it and tell you about what's in it. Now let me come to my little summary, because this is the end. We're then going to look at some complete summary defeated me. I'm going to be showing you big chunks, but I think the most important chunks of the document. I'm told by people who do PowerPoint regularly that, of course, you mustn't have more than about 5 words in any screen, on any PowerPoint. Well, I'm breaking that big time. So it's really up here for you to look at to get a sense of. So I do like the phrase to dialogue, discern, decide. That's from the document, and it's a nice little summary. If you look at my friendly guide, that is really what it's about. So what is synodality? Well, it's a spiritual disposition which is a means to an end and not an end in itself. So it's a method of doing something. It's a means of doing something. Being synodal is not the end in itself. Being synodal is what you do to get to somewhere else. So what are the means? And all of this comes in scattered form from the document, so I haven't made this up. I've pulled these words and these concepts from the document itself. So it's the baptised, because that's the key. Your entree to this particular activity is that you are baptised and therefore part of the church. Being prepared to live out our Christ-centred communion. So it's about Christ. It's about bringing Christ, evangelising, teaching about Christ, being with Christ in a communion. And there's a lot of discussion about the fact that the Vatican II documents, you won't find the word synodal in them, or synod as such. And that is perfectly true. But the point of nexus, which the Church has now put before us to say, well, this is part of the Vatican II reception, this is part of the tradition of Vatican II, is in the notion of communio. It is in the notion that was so strong in particularly the second part of the document on the Church and the world, that the Church is a communion. The hierarchy was the next chapter, but the communion of the people of God was the first part of it. So this is about communion. And then as Pope Leo, we've just seen, has said, by listening. Listening comes first. Think of that wonderful phrase of St. Benedict in his rule, that we listen with the ears of the heart. And so we listen first, then we speak to each other with our minds and hearts open to, again, taken from the document, conversion in conversation. So those of you who, like me, have been on the catalyst journey for a very long time will not be surprised by any of that, because if we are about conversation, we are open to being converted in the conversation. So that's how we do it. But why are we doing it? What is the end of synodality? It means coming to decisions by discerning the Spirit's guidance today for a missionary church. So we have to come to a decision. It is about coming to decisions. It's not about just chatting forever. By discerning what the Holy Spirit is saying today for how we are a missionary church. Mission is a hugely important concept as part of synodality, but in its particular context. So what it's saying is the church exists in many contexts, at a parish level, at a diocesan level, at the level of the Pope, in church institutions, church organisations, church schools. The church exists in all of those contexts. So it is in the particular context, whatever it happens to be, that you are asking for the Spirit's guidance about what is to be done. And that's why I've just added these 3 important points at the end, which struck me as coming out of the document. First, it applies to all levels and manifestations of the church, including the papacy. I mean, there's a whole section in the document of what it means for the exercise of papal primacy and how that might be exercised. The second proposition, which it is quite anxious to make, but which I put a little question mark next to, is it says, well, why we don't change who must exercise authority, it changes how the exercise of authority in the church is to be understood. Now, as you think about synodality, I would just invite you to think whether that is really true. Let me give you an example. Think of your parish pastoral council. In February this year, the Archdiocese put out some guidelines. I was delighted they came out. I asked for a set of guidelines on parish pastoral councils to be written 25 years ago. So all things come to he or she who waits. But the first point it makes in the guidelines is that it's a consultative function to advise and assist the parish priest. So the parish priest canonically is responsible for the administration of the parish. Now, if you are so you could have the meetings, I'm sure we've been to them all, where the parish priest looks at the pastoral council, what are we going to do? Tell me, give me your advice, etc., etc. And then the parish priest decides what's going to happen. That is not the model of synodality. If you read what it says, it means everybody, including the parish priest, is a participant in the process to reach an outcome. And interesting, there's a lovely bit at one point where it then says, when you've gone through this process, if your view hasn't been accepted, live with it. So it clearly contemplates as part of what synodality is all about, an ultimate decision which will not necessarily, of course, reflect the opinions of everybody who's participated in the process. So if you take that to a parish pastoral council level, in fact, it is arguable that it does change where the authority lies, because essentially it means then that the parish priest can't say, well, thank you, I've had a wonderful synodal session, we've decided to paint the walls of the toilet block blue, but I've decided they're going to be green. That is not possible under synodality. So I put a question mark as to the second point. I think it does probably change the locus of authority in the church. The third point is a beautiful point, but hard to understand. It respects diversity, but aspires to unity and harmony and pluriformity. That comes from the document itself. Now, that makes sense to me because I'm a musician. What it means is, essentially, if you can imagine a triad, you've got 3 notes that when they sound together, they sound beautiful, but each is an individual note. So that's what it's really talking about in the church. It's saying, well, we're all individual notes, but what we want to do is to play together in a way that's bigger than the sum of each of us, that makes a beautiful noise. But how that's going to work in practice will be very interesting. So let me turn to the first slide I've put up, because I think we need to start by looking at the covering note from Francis. And this is where he makes the point that the final document is part of the ordinary magisterium of the successor of Peter. And I think it's very important to understand what that actually means. So I've given the 2 parts of the catechism. So there are 2 parts of the magisterium. 891, which is the infallible magisterium, belief as being divinely revealed. Now, all we know is that as soon as you say it's part of the ordinary magisterium, it goes under 892 and it's not infallible. Now, I would need some really good theologians to help you explain precisely how far you can dissent from something which is part of the ordinary magisterium. But necessarily, there is an element of some extent where you say, okay, I accept this as a matter of faith, but there's something I don't agree on. The part that how far you can agree and still be within the ordinary magisterium is not something for tonight. My point is simply that it is said, this is part of the ordinary magisterium, this whole document is part of the ordinary magisterium of the church. Unusually, Pope Francis did not do what has happened after every other synod, where there is a grand document produced that is called an apostolic post-synodal exhortation, where the Pope goes away and says, thanks, I've looked at all this, I'm writing something here for the benefit of all the church. Possibly, and this is speculation on my part, knowing that he was unwell and reaching the end of his life, he may well have simply said, I'm going to adopt the thing holus bolus. But that puts us into the situation where there are bits of it that you would not normally expect to see in a document that is expected to be part of the magisterium. Now, he also said, in approving the document, it is not strictly normative and its application will need various mediations. Well, that just means, yes, you're going to have to make this work in different contexts. However, this does not mean that it does not commit the churches from now on to make choices consistent with what is stated in it. So the local churches and groupings of churches are now called upon to implement in their different contexts, there's that point about the different contexts, the authoritative proposals contained in the document. So in other words, you are actually you're expected to get on with this. And you do it in accordance with canon law and in what the document says itself. Next slide. And it makes a really obvious point, but one worth reminding ourselves on. Some of the things in the document you can already implement. There's nothing in a lot of it that isn't already able to be done under canon law. What remains to be done is that it's got to be done in this missionary synodal style, but you can do it. Simple example, creating an archdiocesan pastoral council. They are under canon law not strictly required. However, this document says you now must have one. I'll leave it to the canonists to argue about what that really means, but eventually the document does contemplate that there will have to be changes to canon law. There's also one of these bits of Italian translation at the bottom you probably can't see, talks about the creative activation of new forms of ministeriality and the missionary action. That I think is a problem of translation because in the Italian it's ministerialità. I suspect it really just means ministries. And so what it is actually saying is that you can implement this by creating new ministries within the church. So we get to the next slide, thank you. What is synodality? Well, it's gathering together to dialogue, discern and decide. That's where I got that language from. It's the walking together, synhodos, of Christians with Christ and towards Christ's kingdom in union with all humanity. We are oriented towards mission, and it involves gathering at all levels of the church for mutual listening, dialogue and community discernment. There's those phrases again. We listen, we dialogue, and then we discern as a community. But the next bit is important. It also involves reaching consensus as an expression of Christ rendering himself present. The end, it consists in reaching decisions according to differentiated co-responsibilities. So you are meant to get to a decision. This phrase, differentiated co-responsibilities, appears in all sorts of places in the document. What is it? Well, all it really means is that different people have different roles in the church. The Pauline principle. Some people are prophets, some people are teachers, some people are this, some people are that. But there is co-responsibility between them for the church. So whatever your special skill is, you're part of a bigger picture which is exercised, including with the ordained, who aren't special because they're ordained, they're at the table because they're baptised, being co-responsible for the church. Next slide. So here we come to this quite important bit. What do we mean when we say it's constitutive? In simple and concise terms, it's a path of spiritual renewal and structural reform that enables the church to be more participatory and missionary so that it can walk with everybody. But the point is, it is actually the church. And one of the things I noticed there that Pope Leo said was, well, it's a something, not the something. If you actually read the document, it's the something. And so, again, we come to this point that it is intended to be constitutive of the church. Next slide. So, it's a spiritual disposition. Permeates our lives. It flows from the action of the Spirit. So the first thing is to ask, what is the Spirit asking? It requires various things like asceticism, humility, patience and a willingness to forgive and be forgiven. There's a whole lot of qualities that are listed there, and you recognise its fruits because you end up with unity and harmony and pluriformity. That's where I got to this point, that phrase from. I'm not just making it up. That is the product that it is inviting us to reach. Next slide. So, to be a synodal church, we've got to be open to a genuine relational conversion that redirects each person's priorities. So it is actually coming along and saying, this may be my priority, but I'm open to conversion through this process. And it talks very much about relationships and relationality, not just being a sort of corporate exercise of management, but one that actually invites us to participate in relationships just as the triune God is a relational God through the Father, the Son and the Holy Spirit. So relating and being relational is an essential part of it. Now, it has some practical suggestions, and there's a whole list of them, and I'm not going to take you through them now. I'm just going to talk about what it says for lay people. So it goes through in the document, thanks, next slide, every possible group you can think of: bishops, consecrated people, people in enclosure, whoever they are, and then it gets to lay people. So we have to be given greater opportunities for participation, to explore new forms of service and ministry in response to the pastoral needs of our time. And I've just given you here some of the, it's the list that appears there. Increased participation in church discernment processes in all phases of decision making, greater access to positions of responsibility in all those sorts of institutions. They are all examples of the things that it says are fruits of synodality. Next slide, thank you. Now, the next one is also quite important, it seems to me. If you're going to engage in the ecclesial discernment that is synodality, it will differ depending on the various places and their traditions. I'll pause there. It's being said quite a bit by people who I deeply respect and who know a lot more about it than me, like my good friend Austin Ivory. Look, this all goes back to a paracida. So those of you who know, a paracida was the document that the South American bishops brought forth. That is true in a sense, but it was a very culturally informed document, as you would expect. The church in South America is very different to the church in Australia, is very different to the church in America, for example. But it then sets out, yes, we've got to do this in accordance with our traditions, but here's a list of things that you've got to do. And so I just ask the question, you can read them for yourselves: setting out the object of discernment, sufficient time for preparation, inner disposition of freedom, next slide, listening attentively, searching for the widest possible consensus without hiding conflicts or searching for the low and common denominator. Now, boy, if any of you have been in a meeting in your business or in your home or in your parish, trying to have a meeting which does that but doesn't reach for the lowest common denominator is not straightforward. But I'm sure the Spirit will help us to get there. This is the bit I like at the end. The discernment process should lead to a mature acceptance by all of the decision, even by those whose individual opinions are not accepted. And then you need a process of reception. So it does assume that people are going to walk away not getting what it is they might have wanted at the start. Next slide, I'm almost done. It talks about the authority of the bishop. This is also quite an interesting passage, because in the middle it says, well, such an exercise of authority, however, is not without limits. It may not ignore a direction which emerges through proper discernment within a consultative process. What essentially it says is, if you're a person of authority in the church, you can't have a meeting, a synodal meeting, have some consultation, and then do as I said. I don't like the colour you've proposed. We're painting the school playground, so I'll paint it. I'm the parish priest. I'm the bishop. Thank you very much for coming to the meeting, but we're going to do what I'm going to want to do. That is exactly what cannot happen in a synodal church. How that is going to play out is going to be very interesting. Second last slide, please. Again, looking at forms appropriate to different contexts. But here's the shopping list of things that are there to be done: effectively functioning finance councils, pastoral and financial planning, a lot of that's already there, preparation and publication of an annual financial report. Again, that's something that I have been asking for in diocese for many years. in the United Kingdom, it's easy. You can get the accounts of the Archdiocese of Westminster because under English law, they have to be registered charities. And as registered charities, they have to publish accounts. So this is one of the interesting things about this document. You will have seen we've gone from high theology to suddenly a list of you must do annual accounts. Now, again, is it an article of faith that we must have annual accounts for our archdiocese? There just seems to me to be perhaps a little tension there in terms of the internal content of the document. So finally, I'll just leave you with this thought, again, which I thought was an important passage. There has to be formation, is essentially what it says. It implies a profound vocational and missionary awareness, a renewed way of looking how we exist within the church. We've got to adopt the practice of ecclesial discernment and a culture of ongoing evaluation. We need formation to make people aware that the gifts received in baptism should be used for the good of all. So formation is very important. So I've probably gone a bit over time, but this demonstrates, I hope I've demonstrated, it's not a straightforward document. I've tried in my little summary to tell you what it's all about, but if it is actually implemented, it will have profound changes in how the church, how we work together, how we live together, how we pray together as church. And it will be at every level. How that plays out will be an interesting thing to watch in years to come. And of course, if it's too complicated, a lot of people won't do it because they just won't get it. And not because they're of ill will or anything else, but if it's too hard to understand, then they're not going to engage with it. Thank you very much. Very happy to take questions later.
No, you didn't go over time. That was a masterful summary. Now, just before we do break for a little chat, I picked up the rhetoric in typical journalist fashion. Part 4, an abundant catch. Now, you see, this really talking about the profound socio-cultural changes that are transforming the understanding of place. Place no longer is conceived in purely geographical and spatial terms, but evokes, in our time, one's belonging to a network of relationships and to a culture whose territorial roots are more dynamic and flexible than ever before. Living in such contexts, the Church is called to rebuild community life, to put a face to faceless entities and to strengthen relationships in this milieu. To this end, we must not only continue to value still useful structures, we also need missionary creativity to explore new forms of pastoral action and identify concrete processes of care. You know, like, I found that a marvellous invitation. I just wonder how you... So there were moments of sort of really quite thrilling calls, I suppose. You found that a little peripheral to a lot of these complications.
Well, I think you asked me to sort of get to the nub of it, and I think the point that you've made, I really haven't touched the last 3 chapters a lot because they're the implementation chapters, and we'll hear a bit more, I'm sure, about that from Gail. But in that very section that you were just reading from, there is a critical passage at 117 which talks about the parish. And what it essentially says is parishes have changed. Because we live in a different way, we no longer have that sense of connection to locality. It says that, parish is a community that is not self-selecting. People gather there from different generations, professions, geographical origins and social classes and status. Responding to new needs of mission requires opening up to new forms of pastoral action to take into account the mobility of the people and the space in which their life unfolds. So it is actually inviting us quite seriously to look at, well, how does your parish function, given that people are coming, they're not just there because they live within 5 minutes walking distance of the church. We all know that people parish shop, that for good reason, whatever their reason, they will come to a particular parish. So the parish's task is to say, well, how does the parish serve those people in this new, very mobile world in which we have? Then, again, the cultural point is important because the end of that passage, in many regions of the world, small Christian communities or base ecclesial communities are the terrain where meaningful relationships of closeness and reciprocity can flourish. Now, that's perfectly true. If we were in South America, and I said to you, communio ecclesial bus, you would all nod your heads and you know exactly what I'm talking about. How many of you actually know what a base ecclesial community is? A base ecclesial community in South America deals with the fact that they do not have enough priests, and so they actually train up lay people as missionaries to look after the needs of particular groups of people. And those communities gather for worship, they have services of the word, the priest comes every now and then to celebrate the Eucharist, but they are profoundly, really beautiful and effective Christian communities, very much in the style of the early church, but they're peculiar to South America. With the exception of some years ago of an experiment in creating base ecclesial communities in Adelaide, I think in the days pretty much of Archbishop Faulkner, pretty much very quickly after Vatican II, they really haven't worked in Australia because the cultural fit is different.
No, and of course they do also talk about the digital. Local churches should encourage, sustain and accompany those who are engaged in mission in the digital environment. And, again, that this becomes something that is real for a lot of young people in particular. So, yes, it does bear. Those last 3 chapters are quite interesting to read, but you do bring out the contradictions, I suppose.
I mean, what I'd love people to think about is, I hope I've given you an idea of what it all means, but the question is, what do you do about it? And that's where I think at the moment, there's an Eliot phrase that I'm trying to remember about, between the something and the something falls the shadow. Effectively, between the reality and the dream falls the shadow. Well, that's, I think people are feeling, and I feel this too. I mean, if you sat me down and said, all right, in this particular ecclesial context, how do I make this work? It's not straightforward. I'll put it that way.
No, but that's what it says. It invites us to think, I think, which is why we're here tonight.
It does. But there's no simple formula beyond doing what it says. I mean, as I tried to do in my little summary document.
Thank you, François, very much. It was a terrific, an awful challenge too. I actually saw François slightly blanch. I thought, I didn't ever think I'd see that in François' face. Now, look, I just think we should sort of turn to each other for about 5 minutes and chat, and then I'll welcome. What's happening? Oh, somebody's right. And then we'll come back and I'll welcome Gail Gill. So do chat amongst yourselves. I'd like to welcome Gail Gill to bring us what she believes are the essentials to take from the implementation document, and she's also going to do an overview of the study groups as well. There were 10 study groups. Is that the proper term? What's it?
Yeah, there's now 12.
Yeah, now 12. Okay.
Yeah.
Because that just came out last week. And given her degree of involvement, she says she's now retired, but she's still very involved in various forms of faith development over the years in her Broken Bay diocese. I think she's really ideally placed to tackle this. So over to you, Gail.
Okay. Thanks, Geraldine, and thank you, François, and I'm hugely relieved I didn't have to tackle a summary of the final document. This one is much, much simpler, although when you go to read it, you'll find it's in the usual Vatican expression of language, I suppose, which is a bit off-putting. But by way of introduction, and François touched on this certainly, but a couple of weeks ago I watched an interesting webinar with Archbishop Tim Costello. He's the Archbishop of Perth, but he was giving the annual Cardine lecture, and he's also, of course, an elected member of the Vatican Synod Council, which works with the Secretariat for the Synod. And among other things, they oversee the implementation of the final document and so have quite a global perspective of what's happening. And Archbishop Tim acknowledged that we all know that things need to change in our church. He also recognised that while some people are energised by synodality, others are wary and fearful, some don't know what it is, some are rather strongly opposed to it, so much so that they'd hoped that after Pope Francis died, synodality might die with him. We're all well aware, as François touched on, and Geraldine did too, that Pope Leo fully participated in the Synod assemblies as Cardinal Robert Prevost. And Archbishop Tim drew attention to some of Pope Leo's interview responses to Elise Allen from Crux. Over the past few months, there's a really no doubt that Pope Leo is fully immersed in the implementation of synodality and is very, very supportive. And perhaps one of the clearest examples was as the Bishop of Rome when he addressed the Diocese of Rome, and it was straight out of the final document. Now you'll see here, that's a photo with some familiar faces from Australia, or one at least, Susie Pascoe, and next to her is Susan Seeler from from Suva, Fiji, and just behind her, standing up, is Cardinal Prevost. So he was there and absolutely immersed in the whole thing. Now, next slide. Thanks, Greg. You'll notice on your handout that the final document is referenced beside each of the possible areas for implementation that's taken from Pathways. In fact, it's cited all throughout Pathways. And as it says, it's the point of reference for the implementation process. Now, from what François has just said, that might be a bit of a problem because how to approach it. And I know Timothy Radcliffe, who did some wonderful spiritual input for the members of the Synod before they gathered together. He has lately written about the final document and said much what François was saying, that it's a wonderful spiritual document, bit confusing, but it's going to be very hard for people to take it up and take it into their hearts. So, next page, thanks Greg. 4 pages are given in Pathways on how to engage with the final document during implementation. And as Pope Francis noted in his little note with the final document, that it's the fruit of a journey marked by listening to the people of God over a number of years. So trying to distill all that has obviously been a bit of a challenge. So Pathways actually encourages both personal and communal reading of the final document that includes prayer and conversation. The way it's written, I thought it a little like perhaps doing a Lectio Divina with that kind of approach with the final document. You need a lot of time to be doing that, but I think how to break it open for people in parishes is really going to be quite a challenge. Next slide, thanks. This is the aim for the implementation phase, which is really very straightforward and ultimately is about planting synodality into every facet of the life of the church. And you can see down the bottom there that the priority is to offer the people of God, all of us, new opportunities to walk together, etc. Next slide, thanks Greg. Now this slide, I've tried to put together a simple way of explaining quite a few pages of who's involved, but who will participate. Very clearly, the entire people of God in a variety of ways, in whatever is possible for their circumstances. And the art of conversation, as François mentioned, may be one thing that we could all begin with. Over 20 years ago, Margaret Wheatley wrote a wonderful little book called Turning to One Another, where she said, I believe we can change the world if we start listening to one another again. Simple, honest, human conversation. And of course, as François mentioned, that is the mission of Catalyst for Renewal in terms of renewal. But you'll find on the Catalyst website too some wonderful reflections on the spirituality of conversation from Father Michael Whelan that are well worth looking at. You may have seen them in the past, but dig them out again and you might find them really helpful. But there's obviously some creative thinking needed at this stage about how to bring an uncomplicated and possible ways of participating in synodality to many people. Because it's, where I am, there's no mention of it at all, no mention in the parishes, and I've noticed a couple of times people reading the Prayer of the Faithful and they stumble over the word synod or synodality because they don't know what it is. So there's a lot of work to be done. But Pathways is also very clear about the diocesan bishop being the person who initiates implementation of synodality, as it's an ecclesial process and the bishop is in charge of all of that. So the next slide, not yet, but will give some detail around all that. Some of the other formal roles are the synodal teams in a diocese. Obviously that's appointed by the Archbishop, and it's supposed to be, or the bishop is supposed to be, a group of people who reflect the composition of the people in the diocese, and a mix of male and female, also lay, clerical, etc., etc., and their names are to be published. You need to know who they are. So some of the formal roles around synodal teams, they recommend that they could also perhaps be in parishes, or they could be in deaneries, and that might be a way to go. Because if there was a synodal team set up in a parish and they have the proper formation to know what they're about, they could actually help to bring this into a parish at a reasonable level, because I think it's beyond the scope of your average pastoral council and people who are there. But obviously the need for formation is critical because they really need to understand what it's about. Pathways also suggest, I've mentioned that, but certainly in Oceania, which we're part of, and the whole Pathways document is very keen to say that whatever we're doing, we should be communicating with each other, other parishes, or other, parishes in other states, dioceses between dioceses, and certainly to help places that haven't got the resources to do things with this. So that's, I think, quite a challenge, because who knows what's happening around Australia unless you've actually gone and found on the Bishop's website where the National Pastoral Research have put together a list of who was holding a synod and when and all of that sort of thing. But you've really got to dig around to find that. And there is a group in Melbourne too called Sense of the Faithful who are beginning to analyse what's happening in various dioceses. I don't know what their methodology is, but they've also got reports on that. So next slide. Thanks, Greg. This is the role of the bishop, and you can see for yourself it's quite, there's a lot more in the actual document, but it's very, very clear that the bishop is in charge and he's the one that gets everything going. Reviews what happens and all the rest of it, and that is supposed to be well publicised. And you'll notice on the handout that you've got there, the timeline for all of this is quite interesting, because there's a lot that needs to happen even before 2027, which is creeping up on us, if you like. And there are a lot of places that haven't even started in Australia. So that's a bit of a challenge. The next one, thanks Greg, is just the role of the synodal teams. And you can see from that there's quite a lot that they need to be able to handle. And obviously they need to be formed in all of that and to have a good understanding of what they're doing. The next slide, thanks Greg. Now this is Dr. Susan Seeler, who does some remarkable synodal work in the Archdiocese of Suva, and she represented the whole of Oceania in the recent jubilee of synodal teams. And each of those teams could ask one question of Pope Leo. And if Geraldine's going to show a clip from that, it's quite an interesting session to have a look at. But her question was, are the groupings of churches, like the Oceania one, for example, which all of those were put together specifically for the purpose of synod, as a way of gathering together, would they continue? And Pope Leo was adamant that yes, definitely that is the way we're going to go. So the expectations around being synodal are really quite all-encompassing when you think about it, not just within Australia, but within those, I think, 4 or 5 other dioceses in Oceania, which is something like 21 different countries, even though they're all small. And we're all to communicate with each other on that. The other thing that I found rather engaging actually with Pope Leo, he remembered Susan Seeler from being on the table with her at the Synod, and was so gracious about acknowledging her and the work she was doing before he responded to the question. So, next slide, thanks. Now, section 4 in Pathways is about methods and tools for implementation. And the section on ecclesial discernment is certainly worth a read. It's interesting to note what it says about the conversation in the Spirit, which seems to have become baptised as the only way to go. And it says very clearly that it's not, that there are other ways, other methods. And it also makes the point that it's preparation for ecclesial discernment. It's not discernment in itself. So you'd all be aware that many religious congregations, for example, have been meeting in a synodal way, even though it may not have been called that, for many years. And each of the major spiritualities has a way of approaching discernment. And I recall, quite some time ago, there was a wonderful book put out by a Benedictine sister who drew from her Benedictine spirituality to help parish councils move away from a parliamentary mode of meeting and to actually listen to each other. It was called Sharing Wisdom. I think it's out of print now. Another one was Donna Markham, a Dominican sister who wrote wonderful things drawing on the spirituality of the Dominicans for leadership. So there are other examples, and just from an observation, I get worried about conversation in the Spirit, because unless people understand what it is and have been prepared to work that way, it just becomes like another corporate way of dealing with things in a group. And it's not intended to be that at all if it's done properly. But people really do need to be prepared for that. Next slide, thanks. Pathways even details the role of the Secretariat. And I put this in because if you haven't looked at the Synod website for a while, it's worthwhile having a look, because it leaves absolutely no doubt that we are part of a global church. And that's just a screen grab of parts of it. And you can forward things to them. I think Sister Natalie is in charge of gathering all those materials, but certainly they welcome submissions to have things there, because the only thing I could find for Australia was a letter from Archbishop Prowse announcing that they were going to have a synod. So I think people here need to, in Australia, get on with that a little bit. So on the back of your handout, there's a list of all of the interim reports of the study groups. And I'll just look at a couple. The reason that they were chosen at the time was Pope Francis was really concerned that all of these issues would overtake the Synod agenda and be too big to deal with. So there were 10 groups, and as you can see, there are more than 10 now. And there are 2 there that are not, strictly speaking, synodal study groups, but one is for the, it's called the Canonical Commission, which Pope Francis set up, and it's busy at the moment looking at laity and women especially, fancy that, and a few other things. And one of the, one that may be of interest too is Group 7, which is concerned with the appointment and formation of bishops so that they're formed in a synodal missionary way. That'll be interesting. Now, Group 2, I'll just mention very quickly because it's facilitated by Sandy Cornish, Dr. Sandy Cornish, who most of you would know. And she's apparently done an outstanding job of pulling things together there. Her Group 2 is on the cry of the poor and the earth, and it includes a subgroup of disability. And she's about ready to go. I think she's got extra time so she can spend that testing what their findings are. Now, just next slide, thanks, and that'll be the last one. This is one of the most controversial ones, and you probably remember it from last year. Cardinal Fernandez didn't turn up when all of the other study groups did to give their brief report to the Synod. He caught up later. Now, it's been organised by the Dicastery for, what is it? The Doctrine of the Faith, sorry, gone blank, yeah. And they've given a really brief report on that, and it's not very different from what Cardinal Fernandez foreshadowed last year. But, and the big but is, the one that many people were interested in was the ordination of women as deacons. That's no longer part of this group. It's gone back to the revived 2020 commission who was examining women diaconate. And there's no clue as to when they're going to report on that. So that's very much a flying...
Well, look, in fact, I was just... We Are Church sent me, or sent everybody, you know, an email about precisely that. That in effect, now we learn the Dicastery for Doctrine of Faith has passed on the issue of women deacons to the second study commission on the female diaconate, which was set up in 2020 but has not produced any report to date. The Dicastery for Doctrine and Faith was given responsibility but has ejected it back to the study commission. The Dicastery has not given any date by which the 2020 study commission will report, as they report directly to the Pope. So they draw the conclusion that Dicastery has managed to completely delete, they would argue,
that's right,
the important issue of women deacons from the Synod. So I suppose it lies in Leo's hands.
Well, it does, and I think, you know, with the... Well, there was no public report from that commission. I think...
they didn't, in these level reports, there was nothing?
No, even in, you know, when they wound up after 2020, I don't know when they finished, but I think with pressure from the USIG, you know, the worldwide meeting of leaders of religious congregations, they put a lot of pressure on Pope Francis, and he came and shared some of it. But I remember Phyllis Sagano, for example, saying, we still don't know what was said, you know, and they were apparently, you know, half-hearted about what Pope Francis shared with them. So it's all very secret, you know, but a little bit disappointing.
So we don't, do you read that? Because I've read it several times. So we don't know when this, going back to that commission, even has to report?
No.
Right.
No date on that, no. Okay.
Thank you.
So that's a whirlwind overview.
Thank you very much indeed, Gail. Thank you. Now, I'm going to let you chat amongst yourselves for a few moments, and again, you know, re-water if you like, and then we'll come back and I'll call François up and we'll have a general conversation and be ready by 9 o'clock. So do collect your thoughts.
Referring to the specific question, I'd like to go back to an expression that Susan used a few minutes ago when she used as a subtitle, pace and scale, and that not all things go along at the same rhythm or the same speed, and that there are indeed differences. One of the differences that apparently many of you experienced, judging by your reaction when the question was asked about the concern that pastors or bishops may experience a diminishing of their authority. Apparently, some of you have had that conversation, let's say. And I would like to invite all of you, as all of us were invited during the sessions of the Synod, to reflect upon what synodality is about and to invite the priests, particularly, even more so than the bishops, I think, to somehow open their hearts and take part in these processes. Oftentimes, the resistances come out of fear and the lack of knowledge. And every person who has reported so far from their region has put as a priority formation. And I think we have to be very clear and sincere about the importance of formation on every level. Sometimes ready answers are given without the proper necessary preparation to arrive at the conclusion that maybe some of us have already drawn, but others are not ready to or capable to understand. And without the proper formation on every level, schools, seminaries, ongoing formation programs, adult formation for laity, et cetera, there are going to be resistances and a lack of understanding. And I think that, at least to a certain extent, we have to understand that we do not all run at the same speed, and sometimes we have to be patient with one another. And rather than a few people running ahead and leaving a lot behind, which could cause even a break in an ecclesial experience, we need to look for ways, very concrete ways at times, of understanding what's happening in each place, what the resistances are or where they come from, and what we can do to encourage more and more experience of communion in this church, which is synodal.
So, I think that was quite an interesting reflection from him. I suppose it's a sort of a warning for him about the importance of formation and pacing. How did you, that's really what you were talking about, Gail, and you've been so involved in this over your lifetime. That's much easier said than done, isn't it, formation?
Well, it is, and I think even, move that?
Yeah.
Even understanding what formation is, which takes a lot of doing, that it's certainly not Catholic adult faith education. Formators really know what they're about, have to know what they're about, because it's the whole person. And I suppose some of it would certainly be intellectual, but that's not the purpose. It really is heart and soul as well, and forming people. And it takes time. The word that comes to me is patience. We've been, I think, in some places very slow to get on with synodality, and it looks as though nothing is happening. But you, Geraldine, for example, mentioned what's happening in Cairns. This vast diocese up there, which has such a mix of people, and some of them that wouldn't be highly literate, and yet they're doing an outstanding job. But it's not being shared across Australia.
No, well, your point is no one knows.
No.
And John Warhurst wrote about this recently. There's so little we know about what is happening to the church across Australia. I suppose even different dioceses we find difficult.
Yeah.
How did you hear that last grad, François?
I think, look, it's a problem that every pope in my lifetime has talked about since the council. Some want to go very fast, some want to go very slow. Somehow you've got to, that's why I don't think any right-minded person would ever want to be Pope, because you've just got to cope with the fact that there's this middle that you don't want to break. Can I come back to something that I think is terribly important in all of this, and comes back to my thought that this is all about, this is a means to an end and not an end in itself. It talks about enabling us ultimately to be a better missionary church. And I actually think we need to deal with what we understand that to be before we start worrying about synodality. Because what is a missionary church? What is it going to be better? And let me explain what I mean. I think most people, when you talk about being a missionary, still have a picture in their mind of somebody going out to Calathumpia to help the fuzzy wuzzies and convert them to Christ. Now, people who do that, that is an incredibly wonderful and important thing. But each of us, if we are a baptised person within the church, is a missionary. We are sent out at the end of Mass, ita missa est, you are sent to be a missionary. But how many of us even individually think, well, how am I a missionary? How can I be a missionary? What is my job as a missionary? To bring people to Christ, to explain Christ, to tell the good news. Now, very often we can simply do it by being ourselves, by being models in our workplace, by being with our families, etc. But the question I would ask, say at a parish level, is this, because perhaps more than many people, I get to go around, I've seen a lot of parishes. To be missionary is different in every parish, because you've got to discern how do you bring Christ, how do you be Christ in this particular parish. And for that to happen in my domestic parish at Mossman is going to be something quite different to what it is in a parish in southwestern Sydney. The needs of that community are going to be quite different. And I think that, in a sense, the way to start synodality, I would suggest, do it at parish level, because we all are in parishes. So let's not worry about the archdiocese, let's not worry about the Vatican. There are people worrying about that. But I would say the way we get synodality going is to actually bring people together to ask this question and do it in a synodal way. And I'm grateful you made the point, Gail, conversations in the Spirit are not the only way to do this. No. They're a wonderful, wonderful thing. But I think there is this complete, and the document itself makes it quite clear, you don't have to do it that way. No, I think there is a real feeling that if you're not doing conversations in the Spirit, you're not doing synodality. Don't think that's right, with great respect. But I would say every parish, bring people together and ask the question, how are we missionaries? How can we be missionaries? What are the needs of this group of people that we are part of? And you answer that question by being synodal, because you will find that there will be a need, there will be something where you need to be present and accompany with in your parish that will be quite different 3 suburbs away. But that's how we find out how we're missionaries. And if we know how we're going to be a missionary church, then synodality is the way to work out how we get on with that.
Well, I must say, when I first picked it up, I thought, oh my God, how I go. But actually, I did read it several times, and I actually found it, I got a great deal from it, I realised, particularly this idea of living within the complex world that we're living in, and I thought that they named that, and I suppose that's because I report on that sort of thing, and actually grasping that it's the isolation of people who consider themselves otherwise successful in the world, so they're not necessarily the completely poor and marginalised. They're not, actually, but they're terribly isolated with this growth of loneliness and the sense that they don't matter and nobody cares. And so I've sort of drawn the conclusion that friendship is a missionary activity.
Yes.
I really have, quite strongly.
That's accompanying someone.
It's growing in me, and I don't know how to apply it. So we have these things called parishes, which are little institutions that are represented in and you realise that they matter, whether or not they're sort of completely relevant. And I sort of feel there's something there that we should be capitalising on while they're there, if you know what I mean. So there's an invitation to draw in far more people than we currently do, but
yes, that the missionary zeal should be almost an invitation just to friendship. But I don't, again, your point is how we actually make this happen. Well, that was your point too. How we make this happen in the modern parish, where we draw in, we're not imposing it. It's attractive, is what I'm trying to say.
Can I just say, the parish I'm in at the moment, highly multicultural, in Broken Bay, and the parish priest there, I've worked with him before, and he was synodal before we even talked about it. He's fairly young. He runs the parish council synodally and has done, and what's emerged out of that is very practical mission, because things like, for example, which he's also hearing in counselling, the loneliness but mental unwellness is a big thing. So he's done something about that and brought in people who can really help. We're also aligned, or part of Sydney Alliance, that deals in very practical issues, which for a lot of the families there are reasonably recent migrants, really struggling, with young families and trying to find a place to live and all the rest of it. And so some of the things that Sydney Alliance does in terms of housing and really practical stuff, we see that as missionary work. And there is every week a dinner put on for anybody. Anybody can come.
Where is it put on?
In the parish. We've got a brand new parish, great big hall there. It's at Epping. And, there are
people come along?
Oh, yes. Huge numbers. And I mean, we're averaging now for the main Mass on Sunday, there'd be over 400 every Sunday. And the dinner is, part of that is not just to eat, but to help people with loneliness and to talk to them. And people make friends. And some of these people, I've been very struck when I'm on hospitality ministry, that you go around and you'll see a family sitting on their own and you talk to them, and some of them have said, nobody talks to us. And these are Sri Lankan people, So I see that as being ultimately highly missionary,
Yes. I must say I'm coming to this view that might be the lower hanging fruit, if you know what I mean. But what about just wave if you want to. What about the formation, the emphasis on formation, which you just dotted throughout? And I just, again, what do we do about that? What is,
See, I've got a thing. I mean, formation, yes, you can, visualise a group coming together for various things, but everything that happens, for example, in a parish, the way, the homily, the decor, if you like, of the church, how people relate to each other, what happens there is part of forming people in what this parish is about. Now, it may not be really positive, but it gets into people's bones that this is the way we do things around here. And that's part of formation from my perspective too.
Just your question was really about formation in synodality.
Yes,
yes.
And I think
which is peppered throughout all.
Well, it is, because you have to teach people about what it is, and how to do it, and I think that's where you just need people who are capable of being formators in that. But I think it has to be.
Facilitators, I think.
I come back to. I'm very convinced it has to be done in a context. This is where I think synodality is not getting traction, because if you just come and say we're going to talk about synodality, you are talking about something that is a wonderful idea, but you've got to demonstrate to people why it's an important idea.
Well, Pope Leo has added one of those extra study groups, and it's on liturgy, and it's all about how can liturgies be synodal, how can the homily be synodal, and the role of women in liturgy and all the rest of it, which has been very, very interesting. It's being run by the Dicastery for Divine Worship, but it's mainly men, mainly ordained men, But there are some very good people, three women who really know what they're on about in terms of liturgy. Yeah.
But, I mean, speaking as the former chairman of the Liturgical Commission, let me tell you about how you can be synodal. It's not rocket science, and any of the ordained here can shoot me down. But a very simple example: how is the homily synodal?
Oh well,
it is synodal in its preparation. There are priests who will, in this archdiocese, who actually have a group of parishioners who they will sit down with on Monday, saying, here are the readings for Sunday. Let's talk about them. What do you, the people of God, get out of this that I can usefully say? And that's important.
I was going to suggest that for those of you who are thinking and continue to think, if you do have suggestions to make, can I suggest that you go to the Catalyst website, Catalyst Renewal website, where you can actually access the email, which I invite you to use, catalyst-for-renewal@outlook.com, and we'd be very keen, in fact, to hear your responses, because I think there probably will be a lot of people sort of dwelling upon this. Look, I want to finish with Pope Francis in his final greeting. Just a tiny bit. He actually reads a poem, Madeleine Delbrel, the mystic of the peripheries, who urged above all, do not be rigid. Let us live our life not as a game of chess where everything's calculated, not as a game where everything's difficult, not as a theorem that breaks our minds, but like an endless party where your meeting is renewed like a ball, like a dance, in the arms of your grace, in the universal music of love. Very Francis, but I think it is quite suggestive of where we might go. Now look, I just must thank some people. The little committee I assembled when this idea first surfaced: Denise Playost, Sandra Lynch, Samantha Wegner and Bernard Evans, all very rushed and typical at this end of the year, just escaping the full madness by getting here on December the 4th. Would have been lovely to have waited, but we felt we had to get something out before the end of the year. We might try to do it again in the early new year. Particular thanks to Denise, who was president, where is she? There she is. Who's president of Catalyst for Renewal, offered all her organisational knowledge of public meetings and school, plus vital funds, small and modest, but vital funds, to make some important basics possible. And I want to really thank you, Denise, for all the personal little phone calls you took from me, who doesn't enjoy organising. That's the producer's role, not the presenter. Julie Thorpe put together the Grabs from Pope Leo, and is recording tonight, and we'll be deciding exactly how we make this discussion available. I think it's quite clear it needs talking about. Big thanks to various people associated with St Pat's here at Grosvenor Street, because they've been terribly helpful. But biggest thanks, of course, to Gail, Gill and François Kunc for submitting themselves to the rigours of getting this ready. So look, thank you all indeed for braving the traffic and being here tonight, and let's hope there's more of this and that we can all be quite creative about what might erupt. Thank you.
Thank you, Geraldine.
Thank you.